Welcome to What the Paper Said, in which I, Patrick Crozier, skim through the Times from 100 years ago, read some of the articles, and comment on the ones I find interesting. In this episode, the week ending the 6th of May 1923, chaos at Wembley, a banker forecasts the Great Depression, and Churchill forecasts the 70s. But first, the headlines. At the moment, every week I begin with what's going on in the Ruhr, and of course there's very little. Some proposals have been made by the Germans. These have been rejected by the French, and that's about all you can say. The British Prime Minister, Andrew Bonar, is ill, as I mentioned before, and now he's gone on holiday for a month in the hope that he will recover. He's currently in Genoa. The FA Cup final did not end well, or did not begin well, that might be a better way of putting it, because there were far too many people on the pitch and far too many people inside the ground, but more of which later. The government has proposed to build a naval base at Singapore. There's a lively correspondence on the subject of humane slaughter, and the King and Queen are visiting Italy. In other news, the member for Berwick has been unseated. What's happened is that there's been a court case brought suggesting that his agent has been fiddling the books, and the court has concluded that yes, this is true, and as a consequence the election was invalid. Now, while the court states that the MP, Mr. Phillipson, is entirely innocent, it has not only deprived him of his seat, but also banned him, according to Wikipedia, I can't find this in the Times, banned him from being an MP or certainly for an MP for that constituency for a number of years. So he's got his wife to stand. If she wins, she will become the third woman MP. There's been a certain amount of correspondence about what's known as the dry ship rule, as you will doubtless be aware. America has introduced alcohol prohibition. In fact, quite a few years ago, I think it's 4 years ago. Anyway, what they're now saying is that no ship may enter American waters carrying alcohol, which is causing all sorts of problems for the shipping lines. The League of Nations is holding an inquiry into the white slave trade. That's prostitution for those who don't know. In the courts, this happened. At the Central Criminal Court yesterday, the recorder passed sentence of 3 years penal servitude and 20 strokes with a cat on James Chandler, 35 seaman, who was found guilty of robbery with violence on a sailor in the East End. The cat, in case you don't know, is the cat of nine tails. Yes, in 1923 they still had corporal punishment. The Times has been speculating on who will succeed Lenin. Obviously everyone knows that Lenin's on the way out and he's clearly very ill. As it happens, he's had multiple strokes and he's, I believe, pretty much immobile, if not effectively a vegetable. Anyway, they reckon that Leon Trotsky, is going to have problems on account of his Jewishness. But at no point, at nowhere, do they mention the name Stalin. The Nazis have been caught with machine guns. I can't imagine why. There is some discussion of an extension of the City and South London Railway. Now, in case you don't know, obviously there's no City and South London Railway now, but the line they built became part of the Northern Line. They were the very first people to build what's known as a deep level tube. That's one with circular tunnels and very small trains. Anyway, they want to extend to Sutton. They're not going to get all that way, but they'll get some of the way. They'll certainly get to places like Balham and Tooting. Also on the railways, the chairman of the London, Midland and Scottish has been paying a visit to Manchester, and during which he said this, or he's reported to have said this: "If the company's civil engineers and mechanical engineers sometimes erred on the side of caution, he would be the last person to blame them, for the safety of the public must at all times be the chief concern of the officers and servants of the company." Personally, I think their chief concern is making money, but it's interesting to see him mention safety as an important factor. The point here is that he's talking about why the train service from London to Manchester isn't as fast as it perhaps could be. There has been a parliamentary inquiry into fish and rivers pollution. This inspired an editorial in the Times in which they said this: reasonable men recognise the impracticability of preventing oil pollution. Also, the weather is unusually warm for early May. Indeed, the record temperature of 81 degrees in the shade, that's 81 degrees Fahrenheit, has been recorded. You may be surprised to hear that this has not induced panic about catastrophic anthropogenic global warming. Instead, it's just induced people to go out and enjoy the weather. In the last couple of episodes, I have mentioned the affair of the Vice-Chancellor of Oxford University and the attempt to open a new theatre in Oxford. This week, the Oxford Union has got involved and is condemning the Vice-Chancellor. Also last week, I mentioned the existence of two Lord Curzons. I mean, it's just been just as well. I've known there's two Lord Curzons because one of them has been fined for speeding. You will be shocked to hear that it's the one who will go on to win Le Mans. And finally, some really disturbing news. World Advertising Convention. Okay, well, yes, I know I'm a libertarian. I'm supposedly in favour of advertising. And, well, yes, I am. It's an exercise of free speech, and that's always a good thing, or usually a good thing. And advertising probably has its merits. I'm not quite sure what they are. As mentioned earlier, the FA Cup final did not go well. This is from Monday the 30th of April. The Bolton Wanderers beat West Ham United in the Cup final at the Wembley Stadium on Saturday by 2-0. This bald statement represents the result of the football side of a matter which has been discussed from many points of view for months. The fact that the Wembley Stadium has been advertised as the greatest of its kind had much to do with the enormous crowd which came from all sorts and conditions of places to see the first cup final to be played there. The claims made for the stadium were not in the slightest degree extravagant. It was built to hold 125,000 people in comfort, and to give to each and every one of that huge total a fair view of the football ground and the track. The stadium can hold even more than that number, and yet give to all the spectators a fair view, but no building and ground could accommodate 300,000 people, and at least that number must have turned up on Saturday at Wembley. Except on two important points, the spirit of the people and of the police, and the absolute loyalty of a very mixed congregation to the King, the day was an ugly one. Many ticket holders never reached their seats. Others got to their seats in plenty of time and were pushed out of them, whirled away like straws on a stream by the sheer weight of numbers sweeping irresistibly forward from behind. By the help of large reinforcements of police, mounted and unmounted, and the players who appealed right and left for fair play, the ground was gradually cleared, the people being pushed back to the touchlines. That play could ever be begun and continue seemed at one time quite impossible. That the seemingly impossible could and did happen was, one must believe, owing to the presence of the King, whose reception when he reached the ground was an event to remember. We also have some eyewitness testimony from a Sir Frank Sweetenham. This is what he has to say. Having passed the turnstile, a steep staircase led to a landing and a small door giving access to the upper tiers of the stadium. The staircase was crowded and the landing blocked by a mass of people, whose further progress was stopped by a civilian and a constable at the doorway. After some time, the jammed mass determined to get in, and pushed through the doorway, thrusting the keepers aside. I was carried in as by a tidal wave, considerable squeezing, but no real damage. Once inside, and looking down from a great height, the scene was curious. The football ground was occupied by thousands of people, standing or walking about. No grass was visible, and only the tops of the goalposts. But on the running track, at both ends of the ellipse, there were large empty spaces, showing that great masses of people had left positions from which they could see nothing, and had walked on to the playing ground. For 40 minutes, what looked like a comparatively small body of police, with about a dozen mounted men, struggled rather aimlessly with an elusive crowd of thousands. The chaos did not end at the stadium. Many times on this return journey, when the train was standing still, my fellow travellers opened the door and shouted pleasantries to the engine driver. "Has your coal run out, or have you only lost your way?" But the railway arrangements must have been admirable too, for when the cup tie enthusiasts found themselves at Marylebone, many hundreds of them crowded to the locomotive and cheered the driver derisively. Poor man, it was not his fault. So how many people were hurt? It is estimated that the Middlesex and County of London detachment of the British Red Cross Society attended to 1,000 people during the afternoon. 20 cases were treated at Willesden Hospital. Of these, 11 were allowed to proceed to their homes on Saturday night, and the remaining 9 were detained. Last night, all the patients were reported to be progressing favourably. I think we should point out that this event was not all ticket, and it was a new stadium, and as I've mentioned earlier, there was fantastic transport facilities, and there was a London club. So what happened is huge numbers of people turned up without tickets, wanting to gain entry, and then they started climbing over the turnstiles. I mean, there's even footage of this. It should also be pointed out that the low casualty, or low number of casualties, is probably due to the fact that there were no barriers at the edge of the pitch or the edge of the stadium. That's what happened at Hillsborough in 1989. There were barriers, people had nowhere to go, and they were crushed. So it was probably, they were very lucky at Wembley they didn't have those. Over the weekend, a delegation arrived in London. This is from Monday the 30th. The deputation sent by the non-official Indian members of the Indian legislature, with the support of the Government of India, to assist in presenting the Indian case at the current Colonial Office discussions as to the position of Indians in Kenya, arrived in London last night. There's a lot in that sentence I don't quite understand. What is a non-official Indian member? I don't know. Obviously there's some sort of Indian legislature. Is it elected? I suspect so, actually. And it also has the support of the Government of India, which of course is, it's a part of the British government, or part of the British Empire. Anyway, it goes on. Speaking to a Reuters representative, Mr. Sastry, he's the head of the delegation, declared that India felt very strongly on the subject of her emigration. She had passed a law restricting very stringently the emigration of the common labourer, and had thus freed every part of the empire from the fear of being swamped by that part of her population which was economically likely to come into serious competition with white labour. There are ructions elsewhere in the empire. This is from Tuesday the 1st of May, and it's from a correspondent. In the Cape there are today over 14,000 native voters on the rolls, and although they do not return natives as members of Parliament, their power is enough to determine the result in more than a dozen constituencies. I think when he says do not return natives as members of Parliament, I think what he means is that they're not allowed to. Anyway, he goes on. There are not more than 2 or 3 native voters in Natal. The next step in the evolutionary development of a suitable form of native self-government seems to involve the withdrawal of the supervision of the European official. Many friends of the natives look upon this step with forebodings, but it seems necessary that it should be taken if the people are to progress, and it may be that the European friends will have to stand aside and watch the native make mistakes. I'll leave that to the listener's judgment as to whether that happened or not. He goes on. Sooner or later, the demand of the native for the franchise will have to be met. Later, as it turned out. Mind you, it could be worse. This is from Tuesday the 1st. In the town of Columbia, Missouri, where the University of Missouri is situated, a mob in which there were many youths and young women, yesterday morning took a Negro from jail and hanged him to a railroad bridge. The victim of the lynching, James Scott, was a janitor in one of the college buildings. He had been accused of a criminal attack upon the 14-year-old daughter of Professor Almstead of the university. The latter made a passionate appeal to the mob to give up its intention, but he was roughly swept aside. It took 2 hours to storm the jail, and the inner doors had to be cut through with acetylene torches. The sheriff telegraphed to the governor for militia, but by the time the troops were underway, the crime was accomplished. Acetylene torches. I mean, you do wonder why they're going to all this trouble when, if the man is guilty, he's probably going to get convicted anyway. If he's innocent, I mean, as I understand it, he was probably going to get convicted. I can only imagine there's a lot of distrust among white inhabitants of the South of the court system. But that's bizarre too, because that is a system which is created by the state government, if I've got that right. Cause and effect. This is from Saturday the 5th. Cotton planters and other farmers in the South have become alarmed at the migration of thousands of Negroes to the northern states, attracted by high wages. Amazing. It goes on. Joint meetings of whites and Negroes to devise plans to check the exodus of labour will be held in every courthouse in Mississippi on May the 10th. Joint meetings of whites and Negroes. I'd love to have been a fly on the wall of that. Weird. Anyway, any black who was emigrating north, especially to Chicago, might have bumped into F.C. Goodenough, the chairman of Barclays, who was making a speech to the Industrial Club of Chicago. This is how the Times reported it on the 2nd of May. It was now becoming apparent that gold was itself in some risk of depreciation in terms of commodities, owing to its accretion in America, coupled with the fact that under the Federal Reserve Act, such gold could be used as the base for the construction of a very great volume of credit. Unless that credit was used in such a way as not to exceed legitimate demands, it was certain that a rise in the value of commodities would take place. Now, I can't claim to entirely understand that sentence, but I think what he means is that due to the First World War, the Federal Reserve has ended up with a lot more gold than it used to have, and it can issue more notes as a consequence. And more notes in circulation means higher prices. Anyway, he goes on. A commencement of such a rise, he continued, was in evidence at the moment, and with the great powers of internal expansion in America as an inducement on the one hand, and no very definite check on credit creation on the other, it could be understood that a situation might arise which would develop into a grave danger both to America and to the world at large, both financially and industrially. So is he here predicting the Great Depression? Well, if he is, well, that's pretty impressive. At least someone did. The only fly in the ointment is, to my knowledge, is Murray Rothbard's The Great Depression. Now, he sought to prove that the Great Depression was the consequence of an inflationary policy by the Federal Reserve in the 20s, as Goodenough seems to suggest here. But I don't think he made his case very well. It seemed to me he started with his conclusions and worked backwards, and I don't think that's ever a good way to operate. Anyway, Goodenough goes on, or rather the report goes on. Mr. Goodenough said that because of their common interest in the matter of world prices, Great Britain and America could and should endeavour to assist each other, so as to obviate any really serious crisis taking place through a too rapid alteration in price levels due to the accumulation of gold in America. That assistance could take the shape of an agreed currency policy with regard to gold shipments from America, when the recovery in the sterling-dollar exchange to slightly above parity should render withdrawals possible. It would be a misfortune to America for a too rapid drain of gold to take place, because of the effect upon her prices. It was necessary to make any readjustment of prices throughout the world so gradual that the minimum disturbance of existing conditions was occasioned. I can't deny I'm amused by this idea of minimum disturbances and gradual changes. It seems to me in the field of economics, you never get a gradual change. It's always pretty dramatic and pretty nasty when it does happen. Since losing his seat at the general election, Churchill has busied himself writing his war memoirs called World Crisis. But he hasn't as yet made any public pronouncements. But this has now changed, and this is from Saturday the 5th. He couldn't resist the urge to allude to the chaos at Wembley. "I can assure you that I am in no hurry to give up my seat in the stands at the stadium and join the pleasant throng of crowd, players and police inspecting and occupying the football ground." He then went on to notice that there seemed to be very little difference between the Conservative and Liberal parties these days. This may be important later. He also proposed the alternative vote, which doesn't seem very Churchillian at all. But the main thrust of his speech was aimed at communism. This is what he had to say. "But do not be under any delusions about what socialist rule means. It involves a vast and revolutionary change in our whole economic, financial and industrial system. A change which from its very first inception must lead to an enormous increase of taxation, a fearful shrinking of credit and enterprise, and a vast restriction both in production and in employment. It involves an enormous deprivation of individual liberty. In every direction the state must interfere. In every detail of life and industry, the officials of the state in the great public departments must be the arbiters." So was he right? In Britain, socialism probably peaked in the 1970s. So, do we have high taxation? Oh my goodness, yes. I think 98% was the top rate. Did we have a shrinking of credit and enterprise? Well, I can't talk about credit and enterprise. Well, yes, Britain was a lot less entrepreneurial by the 1970s. A vast restriction in production and employment? Well, certainly we got a lot poorer. Well, that's not quite true. We actually got richer, but we got richer at a much slower rate, and the difference between ourselves and the Americans was very apparent. There was also high unemployment in the 1970s. Then he said, and it involves an enormous deprivation of individual liberty. I'm not sure about that one. It seems to me that nowadays things are far, far worse in terms of freedom of speech than they were in the 70s. Certainly a lot of people complained about trade union closed shops in the 70s, and they have more or less been abolished. Other than that, other than economic liberty, I mean, certainly it was very difficult to run a business in the 70s. So in that regard, things have changed. But otherwise, I'm not sure Churchill's right here. Anyway, that's all for this week. I aim to have something up next week, but I promise nothing.